Welcome to those in the audience who tuned in late. Very good evening to all of you. Those who are in India, good morning and good afternoon to people from around the world. This is the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators Young Members Group ADR World Tour, and we are now moving on to session 2 of day 1. And the moderator for this session is the most amazing Shwetha Bidhuri. She is the head South Asia of Singapore International Arbitration Center. She has over a decade's experience dealing with international commercial and investment arbitration. So without further ado, I'll just mention one thing. I might pop up a couple of poll questions on the way for the audience to answer, which is going to be material that's going to contribute to the comparative study and publication that we're going to do after the end of this world tour. So over to you, Shwetha.
Thank you, Ishan, for such a kind and exaggerated introduction, if I may say so. So good evening, everyone. Thank you once again to CIArb YMG for inviting me to moderate this session. I'm extremely delighted. Firstly, because we have such a wonderful panel of speakers, and also because the topic is of personally great interest to me. So I hope to learn a lot as we go along in today's session. So joining us today, we have Dr. Rishab Gupta, a partner of Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, Mr. Ravi Shankar Jha, Senior Investment Specialist at Invest India, and Manasi Chatpalliwar. I hope I got it right, Manasi.
Yeah, it's Chatpalliwar. The T need not be enunciated so much.
Okay.
But you got it right.
Almost right. So, and Manasi, Principal Associate PNA Law Offices. So as the world is, of course, now becoming more integrated place, so are the investors and trade. We've of course seen a rise in a lot of cross-border investments. And in fact, India has been at the spotlight of investment arbitration in the last decade. So today's session, I think, is particularly more important because we are kicking off the next decade. So it's important to reflect on what has happened in the last decade, what has been our learnings, where has the trend been. So I think to all of the things that have happened over the 10 years, if I could just summarize quickly and then move on, from one topic to the next for our discussion. So basically, the decade started with a flurry of investment arbitrations involving India under the various investment treaties. Then, of course, we saw India's response as a rethink to the entire regime, where treaties were terminated, a new model BIT was introduced. We also saw a culmination of these investment treaty arbitrations. In fact, last year, some of them had the decisions being rendered. So now, with all of this happening, the central question was, would this affected the FDI in India? And also the, at some level, the concern for what would happen to Indian investors who are investing outside of India. So I think that, being really the central point of why do we have the investment treaties in the first place? Is there a direct correlation between the two? So I think maybe Ravi can give a glimpse into the landscape of FDI over last few years and can give some sense of if there has been at least some relationship between what we've been seeing in the investment treaty landscape and directly the impact on FDI. So Ravi, over to you first to give us a presentation and give us an overview of this FDI landscape. Ravi, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you very much, Shwetha. Now let me see if I can share my screen. Quickly. Can you see the screen? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so thank you very much. So I think I will first lay down in terms of, I'm sorry, this is going to be a rather sort of a boring few minutes because I'll just put out some dry numbers and data to kind of highlight what the trends that has been that have been there or shaping up in Indian investment landscape, especially in terms of FDI inflow and outflow. But let me kind of bring your focus to, what has been the change, so to say, or rather the impact of what we have all been going through, which is the whole pandemic. Now, just to highlight, the resilience of Indian economy in terms of its ability to attract foreign direct investments, this chart is really, really instructive, because almost all major developed economies have seen a major decline in the amount of FDI that they have attracted. And the only two exceptions to that across the globe have been India and China. China still saw 13% increase in FDI, and China saw 4% and India saw 13% increase in FDI despite the pandemic that we have been going through. In fact, if you look at the proportion of FDI and the reinvestment earnings, that has also been consistent over the years, somewhere around 1/3, 33% for India, which kind of goes on to show that people have fairly decent level of confidence in the Indian economy. And that is a sentiment which is shared across the globe, because even when we talk to the investors, I think there is a growing realization that for any foreign investor looking to enter India, it can look a bit scary, a bit chaotic, but it's not really for faint-hearted, so to say. But then anyone looking to enter Indian market has to be prepared for the long haul. He or she may not get the desired results if the intention is to make quick bucks and leave the country. So that being the case, let me just kind of highlight the investment trends over the past 15 years insofar as FDI inflow is concerned. There has been a consistent increase in the amount of FDI that the country has attracted. And on an average, it has grown on 13% year on year. And of course, during this period, we saw various BITs being entered into, and then post around 2016, we saw many of them being scrapped as well. However, there is no tangible impact, so to say, on the amount of investments. Now, I mean, we all understand correlation is not causation. So it requires a kind of a detailed study to estimate what is the exact impact of absence or presence of those BITs on the investment climate or the amount of investment that the country attracts. But the growth in the amount of FDI that India has been attracting has been pretty much consistent. In the last 20 years, we have attracted 721.7 USD, and out of that, 325.8 USD, which is pretty much 50% have come in last 5 years itself. And this is the period where India has had some issue with its BITs. So despite that, we have seen that global interest in India's economy has remained there, and people are looking to invest. In terms of where most of these investment is coming from, the top countries where it is coming from are Mauritius, Singapore, USA, Netherlands, and Japan, with Mauritius being pretty much a consistent, and it's a kind of switch between Mauritius and Singapore that happens now and then. But Mauritius and Singapore have been two sources of FDI for India. Just to highlight the period during COVID, we did see some decline in Q1 of 2020, but the figures kind of came back immediately in Q2, and in the latest quarter, we have recorded $28 billion of FDI, which is the highest in the last 15 quarters. So despite a kind of blip, a minor blip in the first quarter, we see that the confidence of foreign investors in the Indian market has kind of come back, because they realize that this is just a one-time shock, and the fundamentals of the economy are strong enough to merit a long-time investment in the country. In terms of sectors where these investments are coming from, of course, the biggest sector continues to be the services sector and computer hardware and software, with others going construction, activities, and chemicals and automobile industry, while the remaining 34% is to the miscellaneous part. So you see the services sector is the one that attracts most of the FDI, and there are good reasons for it, because one thing which India is infamously famous for, which is bureaucratic red tape. That kind of remains. The regulatory cholesterol in this sector is limited in this sector, and therefore it has been attracting large amount of FDI over the period of last 20 years. Now coming, if I were to kind of give a few more specific data points in terms of how India has been doing in terms of attracting FDI, especially during this whole pandemic period. What has emerged is that information and communication technology, the ICT sector, has been a major driver of FDI in India. There have been quite a few number of mega deals. So one of the most prominent one being, of course, there's fair bit of investment coming into Reliance. Beyond that, the acquisition of Essar Steel by a Japanese-Indian joint venture has been a major contributor. With the deal was worth $7 billion in itself. So that's another reason why India has seen this push, all right, in attracting foreign direct investments in India. In terms of what India has been sending out, again, because of this pandemic, we have seen in this whole South Asian region, India is actually the biggest outward FDI source. But then Indian companies have on an average seen 25% decline in their revenue during the pandemic. And that's the reason why the outward investment from India has declined as well. The number of greenfield investments, this is coming from UNCTAD report, the number of greenfield investments have come down by 4% and M&As have contracted by 58%. That's what the latest UNCTAD report tells us. However, the report also points out that these are just temporary blips, and as the economy recovers from this pandemic, we will see more and more investment coming out of India as well. However, despite this investment, even at normal levels, India as a source of FDI continues to be a rather not such a prominent source of FDI if you look at it from a country basis, which continues to be the topmost contributors of FDI or sources of FDI continue to be US and China. But India is picking up, suffered a minor setback during the pandemic, but hopefully it will pick up after that. In terms of sectors where Indian businesses are investing, if you look at this chart, financial, insurance and business services, BFSI, is the most prominent sector where Indian investment is going out. And this is data till January 2021. After that, it's manufacturing, and then wholesale, retail and others is where most of the Indian investment is going. So I'm running through this because I don't want to bore the audience with and kind of badger them with all the dry numbers. But this is where we stand in terms of numbers. Just to kind of come back to that point which you were trying to highlight, that is what has been the impact of BIT, presence or rather termination of it, and how India's investment climate or has been perceived outside India because of that. I'm afraid I do not have a direct answer, but in our interaction with the investors, whenever there is a big ticket investment that is coming in, there are some concerns about the enforcement of BITs, and that which is highlighted time and again. But what the government also is aware of that concern. There is thinking within the government that this is going to be a concern going forward, and needs to be, and something needs to be done about it. Of course, there are some political reasons why things are not turning out at a speed they should be, but that the fact that the government is aware of the concern and is keen to work on this issue. But having said that, except for some of these big ticket investments, we don't really see that the presence or absence of BIT is swinging the decision to invest in India, especially where, in fact, there are many investors that we advise who are looking to compare the attractiveness of the jurisdiction as compared to some of our peers, which are Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam being one of the most prominent ones. And in my limited experience, what I've observed that it's other concerns like the availability of land, business permits, electricity availability, labor laws, and others figure much high in their in the points which matter to them than BITs exactly. So that has been my experience, but this is not really backed by any hard data that I can present. It is all a subjective experience. But there are, at the same time, there have been some investors which have spoken about their concerns with respect to BITs. So I think I'll stop, and then once we go with our discussion, once we go forward with our discussion, maybe I'll be able to contribute a little more to it.
Thank you so much, Ravi. I think that's extremely useful, to have the hard numbers in front of you, and rather than talking vaguely, in theory about what the impact could have been or has been in that sense. And I think very important point that it's not only the presence of treaties that's an important consideration for the investors, but there are multiple factors that investors take into account before they consider a jurisdiction for investment. So in fact, just a small follow-up question, which if Mansi or Rishab may want, they can take it up as well. How important is it for investors to have investment arbitration as the mechanism to resolve investment disputes?
I think if you ask me, it's actually very, very critical. Of course, it becomes far more critical in India. And that again is an area that as I speak, I'm working on with the relevant ministries as well. So there is that feeling with that awareness again within the government that it is just not possible to reform the judiciary and bring it up at a level where it should be to ensure that enforcement of contract and others happen as seamlessly as some of our competing jurisdictions. So there is that increasing awareness that we need to make India an arbitration hub so that both the load on the judiciary goes down and the settlement of disputes becomes far more smooth, because that remains probably the number one impediment to investments in India going forward. So that makes arbitration that much more important. And I think it's very, very critical for investors to explore that avenue to get their get their disputes settled completely, no doubts about it.
I think that also kind of explains why India has not completely done away with the BIT regime and is having a rethink, and in some way evaluating along the process. Yeah.
Yes, so, of course. Yes, there is that thinking.
Correct. So over to you, Rishab, now to the very important question. Like I said, in the last decade, India has seen most significant developments in investment arbitration and has really been at the center of the world's attention to what it has been doing, how it's been responding. Also, there have been slew of arbitrations. Some of them were withdrawn. There were some arbitrations involving India that were decided in favor of India. Some were decided against itself. There were also complex issues, including those of procedural issues of confidentiality, etc. What do you think have been the greatest learning, if we can sort of point out for states and investors both, from these arbitrations that we've seen in the last 10 years?
Yeah, thanks, Shwetha. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me for this. So what I did in preparation for this is that I sort of jotted down from my side what I feel are sort of 9 takeaways or 9 lessons that emerge not necessarily from recent disputes. See, I personally, to my mind, those disputes and those awards by themselves don't mean much, because any state, like any litigant, will have some successes and some losses, right? So while Kane and Vodafone are all over the news, what was not in the news as much are the successes that India had. So whether it's in relation to Lou Dreyfus, whether it's in relation to the Access case and so on and so forth. So I don't think that matters so much, but there are some general points that I think any state, any respondent state could take into account when thinking about investment treaty arbitration at a more comprehensive level. And sort of the 9 points that I jotted down were from that perspective. So I'll just go through those, and if you or anyone in the audience has questions, I'm happy to take them, with the slight caveat that, as you know, Shwetha, I'll have to jump off at 7 p.m. Yeah. So I'll go with my 9 points, and then I'll unfortunately shortly after that jump off. So the first point is, in my view at least, is that design your treaty regime properly. Yeah, that's the key. That's the underlying premise. That, to my mind, has 3 sub-questions, and each one has to be answered. The first is, do you even want investment treaties at all? Yeah. Now that goes closer to what Ravi was discussing, that do you see any positive advantages of having investment treaties, whether that's in relation to increase in incoming foreign direct investment, whether that's in relation to giving protection to your companies that invest abroad. Now, Ravi has done some work in this area. As probably you know, Shwetha, I've done my own study of the relationship between investment treaties and foreign direct investment. My personal view through talking to investors and through survey results is that actually there are not that many investors who are genuinely taking BITs into account. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that BITs have to be the primary reason for which you would decide to invest in a certain location. It would never be, because ultimately you have to remember that the political risk which a BIT reduces has a premium attached to it. So if an investor thinks that they would make substantial profits by investing in India, for example, and they don't have proper dispute resolution rights available, they'll just put a higher premium on that investment. So unless there's a substantial profit to be made, they may not come into the country. But in any event, that's the first decision you make. The second is, having decided that you want to have BITs, what kind of substantive protections are you going to offer to your investors? Now, in my view, at least, the model BIT was a step in the right direction. We can debate the content of model BIT forever, and perhaps some of it goes a bit too far, but to have a negotiation a template to work with, of course, is the step in the right direction. So you got to decide what substantive protections you're going to give, narrow, slightly broader. You're going to carve out certain sectors. You're going to carve out certain areas of policy making like taxation and so on. That's purely a sovereign decision, but you got to make that decision in a considered way. And the third subpart of my first point is that you decide what kind of procedural protections you're going to offer to the investors. Now, for example, are you going to be part of ICSID? In the Indian context, of course, we are not part of ICSID, but that's a considered decision. By being part of ICSID, you're obviously signing up to a self-contained system, and you're doing away with the prospect of any challenge in the national courts. India has chosen not to do it, and it's not my position to criticize that at all. But that has to be a considered decision. It has its pros and cons. If you decide not to go with ICSID and you want to go with a system where challenges are permissible, then you also got to ask yourself what kind of rules should apply to any dispute that would in fact arise. In the current context, it's largely UNCITRAL, but that's not the only arbitration rules available. Shwetha, you know very well that SIAC has, for example, its own investment arbitration rules. They're quite well designed. They're specifically catering to investor-state disputes. They have advanced provisions about confidentiality, about third-party funding, early dismissal of cases. And of course, as a state, you've got to take all of that into account and then decide how you build your treaty regime. So that's the first lesson, or the first thing you've got to keep in mind, that how are you going to design your treaty regime? Because that ultimately would determine everything else that follows from there. Yeah. Now, the second lesson in my view is that having decided what your treaty regime would look like, you got to socialize it. And when I say socialize it, you've got to train at every level of your government exactly what those treaties are and what those protections are. And that's extremely important because ultimately we know that protections available under treaties, like any other obligation under public international law, applies not just at the central or the federal level, but also applies at the state or the local level. Nissan's dispute against India is a classic example of something happening at a state level, which leads to a dispute effectively against the central government. So you've got to do that. you got to also keep in mind that the training doesn't have to be purely at the executive level, but it has to be at every branch of the government. So be it legislative, be it executive, be it judicial. Yeah, because again, we know from a public international perspective, the actions of each and every branch of the government are ultimately attributable to the state. And in the Indian context, quite interestingly, actually more disputes have arisen because of what the judiciary has done, as opposed to what the executive or the legislature might have done. So you got to train your judges, and you got to make them realize that while you may decide whatever you decide, keeping in mind your constitutional obligations as well, they may have repercussions at an international level as well. Yeah. So you got to keep that in mind. So that, to my mind, is the second part of how you go forward from here and what key takeaways there. Now, the third thing is that having done the first and the second step, when you do take policy decisions, keep in mind that it might have repercussions at an international level. So for example, if you want to ban incoming investment from China in certain sectors, that's of course a sovereign decision. You should be entitled to do it. But if that thereafter leads to claims under investment treaties or other kinds of claims in the WTO, that's fair game as well. And you've got to take that into account in ascertaining the pros and cons of any policy decision. And that's very important, because the moment you start doing that, when the claims in fact arise, you shouldn't be reacting to it as if this is completely coming off piste, because it's very much part of your policy decision making. And in fact, when those claims arise, you should be ready to settle them. I'll come to the settlement point separately. If you are taking all of this into account, your reaction to any claims would be very different than the kind of reaction we're seeing at the moment. So that's my third lesson over there. Just staying with the third lesson for a second is that if you do decide to do a proper pros and cons analysis, taking into account the possibility of future claims, just beware that what you should not get into is what, in this parlance is typically called regulatory chill. So of course, there are progressive legislations that you've got to introduce, right? You've got to protect the environment, for example. You've got to protect public health. Now, in doing so, if you're going to introduce certain legislations that would lead to investment treaty claims, then so be it. And that goes back to my first lesson, which is that when you're designing your investment treaty regime, carve out things, create protections for yourself, create exceptions so that those progressive legislations can be introduced. So that's part of my third lesson. Now, moving on to the fourth. Once the dispute arises, as it inevitably would, we know that under investment treaties, there is the practice of sending a trigger letter, there is a cooling off period, usually 6 months in India's case. Use that 6 months period, yeah? Try and settle the disputes as much as you can. That's what any commercial party does. And one should look at these disputes to a large extent once they've arisen from a commercial lens. So use those 6 months as much as you can to settle the disputes, and that has its own kinds of subparts to it. One is, of course, you got to empower your bureaucrats, empower your negotiators to actually be able to settle, right? One of the biggest problems at the government level, and that's not necessarily just in the context of international disputes, that's true in the context of local disputes as well, that it becomes difficult for anyone to settle, especially when the settlement involves payment of money, when it involves writing a check. But you've got to empower people to do that, right? Equally, you could build procedures around how those settlement discussions would be done, what would be the protocols around it, and so on and so forth. So that's my fourth point there. The fifth point is that let's assume, be unsuccessful. So empower your advisors to give you the advice that there is no point in challenging, for example, and you should settle, and then empower your own officials to be able to write that check. And that's important because that goes back to, in a way, what Ravi was also saying. It goes back to reputation. Complying with your international obligations is not simply either not doing anything wrong or participating in the arbitration. It is also then complying with the arbitration award. And where you think compliance is the right route, and in many cases it would be, do it. And the ninth thing, which is more coming out of recent events, is that ultimately there'll be instances, there'll be cases where execution proceedings will commence against you, as it has in Kane's context, in different jurisdictions. I don't think India really has the experience of having to defend execution proceedings in multiple jurisdictions. And that again is an experience which over time has to be developed, because it's not the first time it will happen. It will happen in the future as well. And you've got to understand how to be able to defend these multi-jurisdiction proceedings. So those are my 9 lessons, points. They're not necessarily related to any specific dispute, but they're just sort of general pointers that anyone could take into account, a respondent state at least. So that's it, Shwetha, from my side.
Thank you, Rishab. I think those are very essential 9 points, and it may become a subject of a topic that you could write upon, and extremely useful for Ravi to maybe take back to the government, in terms of what really the feedback is. And I think one of the most important point that I thought, amongst everything that you listed was about settlement. And I think, precisely why prior to 2010, why didn't we hear so much of turbulence about investment arbitration, is because India had chosen to settle the disputes that were filed earlier, before 2010. And it's only because White Industries case sort of came to fore in the way that it did, that all of this had to jumble up, and we had to go through a rethink. And of course we saw these flurry of arbitrations against India. So thank you, Rishab. I think Manasi has a tougher job now after the 9 points to match to that, for any learnings that she thinks that that can be added. And also particularly from the standpoint of investors, what is it that they could have learned from these arbitrations that happened?
Well, I actually, Shwetha, thank you for having me on this panel, and thank you, Dr. Rishab, for making my job extremely difficult. I think I should have preceded you, and then you would have concluded with your 9 points. But I actually agree with all of them, but I just have 2 observations. One is, so you talked about the that you decide a treaty regime and then you socialize the people to kind of follow it. I think for me, that really stood out. I think that's going to be, while it's a very good point, I don't know how it's going to be implemented. I do think it's going to take a lot of time. And I think what India needs to kind of focus on is not just the treaty regime, but how is it going to put in place procedures and protocols for how this percolates down. Because as we've seen in the Nissan case, and in fact in another case where the investment was in Andhra Pradesh, regarding the mining issue from a UAE entity, what seems to be happening is that there is a serious disconnect between the state and the center, as Rishab already pointed out. And when he talks about his 8th and 9th point about settlement, I think all of it kind of connects together, where what I'm taking away from this is that the bigger challenge is how, given the socioeconomic position of our people, our economy, and how we deal with investors, I think the bigger challenge is going to be how to kind of have a homogeneous understanding across state governments, central governments, government departments, ministries, and of course the representatives who represent us in defending these claims. But and one more thing which I'll just add as a conclusion is what we've seen a lot in Indian courts is that the moment something like this happens, there's always an anti-arbitration injunction that somebody attempts to get. Now, that is still also a gray area which we need to address, because I don't think that the Indian Arbitration Conciliation Act is very certain about how to deal with investment disputes. In fact, many courts have said that, this is the tribunal. They've actually upheld the competence principle of, why don't you take it back to the tribunal? But interestingly, I think in January 2020, there were reports that we are considering, the enactment of a legislation which is going to bring in some protection for investors. I'm sorry, I have not seen much on that. I saw the report that was filed by the committee that is assisting the ministry in this regard. But I think that would be a very good step in kind of saying and in kind of executing the points that Rishab mentioned. And I think, but that being said, it will probably take us some time before we can aim to put this in motion. So that's my observation of what Rishab was saying. with respect to the investment treaty regime as it stands. I believe if Ravi wants to add to that, otherwise I was thinking of moving on to the next topic.
No, I think I might be completely off the mark here, but here is what I think about these issues in my experience of dealing with the investors. I think many a times, I mean, there's a feeling that investors tend to go to jurisdictions where they have lax regulatory policies. Now, my experience suggests that it's often not about the kind of policies that you have, as much as it is about how consistent those policies are. It's about predictability that gives you an edge. So even if India were to take a road which is not so favorable or not considered so favorable internationally, I think it always makes sense to have a consistent stand on this is how we'll deal with it, right? So that anyone who is looking to make a decision factors that in his or her decision making. So I think that policy predictability is something which to me is of critical importance. You can even choose to have a kind of a culture where either you say that okay, unless, and something which Rishab was talking about, unless you have a very, very concrete case of succeeding, you will not go and appeal, and that message needs to go out to the investors that, okay, this is how India looks at its investment disputes, and this is how the government will behave, irrespective of which party is in power. Because being a democracy, governments change. So that kind of message needs to go out, and that can come only over a period of time with consistent application of a policy and a stand that Indian state takes. So that's all that I have to add to that.
So I think that Ravi really goes down to the root of legitimate expectations and why a lot of BID arbitrations, the claim is based on violation or breach of these legitimate expectations. That when they came into the jurisdiction to invest and do business, the regime was a certain kind, and over a period of time, the government changed its stance, which of course adversely affected their businesses. So I think that's a key takeaway for the government to consider, because that's also part of your promise to the investors when they come and invest into your jurisdiction. Just one more question from Rishab's standpoint, and maybe Ravi would be appropriate to answer. There has been, of course, a lot of criticism about what India had done, and some said that the way India has reacted is kind of a little bit unfair, in terms of this extreme reaction to terminate all the treaties and etc. But Rishab also said that it's really a sovereign call. Right? It's for the state to decide what my treaty regime is going to be, and it's between the two states to negotiate and come to the table and say, okay, for example, in the Brazil BIT, we don't want to have ISDS. We want to have state to state. Do you think this criticism is unfair, or maybe it is at some level, balanced, looking at from the investor standpoint?
I think the answer lies in another point which Rishab made, which is about, yes, it's a sovereign call. Totally, nobody can deny that. But then you have to be ready to face the consequences as well. That because the investment is a lot about sentiments, not only share market. Many a times your more hardcore strategic investments are also to a great extent driven by sentiments. And I do kind of like to recall this very funny incident where I was talking to one of the executives who used to travel to Bombay at least thrice a month. And once I was talking to him and I said, if that is how frequently you travel, why don't you set your shops here? And very seriously, he replied saying, oh, I don't get good beef burgers here. Which is very, very critical for me. And trust me, this was not just a kind of tongue-in-cheek remark, or my experience has told me that, small little things which go on to make a larger sentiments do matter. So of course, to that extent, sending out a message that India is not really acting abruptly. I mean, if at all state wanted to terminate many of these BITs, probably they could have kind of been more fair in their process, given adequate warning, covered for some of the losses, that could have sent out a lot more positive message, and India would have been able to achieve the same goals which it wants to achieve, let's say through renegotiation of these treaties, including the one which you mentioned. So I think many a times it's a lot about the procedure and the approach that you take rather than just the final decision. So there, I think nobody can deny the sovereign rights of a country to frame its policies. But the way it does or goes about doing that is very, very critical.
So Bansi, turning to you from where Ravi has left is, maybe as the last point for today's discussion before we take any questions that we may have, is where is the current framework for investment treaty arbitration in India? We of course have seen multiple treaties being signed after the model BIT. Some were largely based closer to the model BIT. Some were a little bit away from it. For example, the Brazil BIT, which seems to be more based on the Brazil model BIT than the Indian model BIT. Could you just highlight some of these key points, in the current regime that India has to offer? And also what, in your viewpoint, if you think there will be takers, for this current regime at all?
So thank you, Shwetha. So yeah, right. Currently, so you're right. The Brazil BIT actually is like a synergy of the Brazil model BIT and the India model BIT. And what we are seeing in the India-Brazil BIT is that there are a lot of clauses which are there in either the Indian BIT or the Brazilian BIT. It's interesting because both the countries have sort of attempted to, kind of protecting their sovereignty, but still kind of jumping onto the international plane. So what this is clearly showing what we've seen as the nations have, kind of projected in their view. Both countries have gone on record earlier to say that they find the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism a little bit skewed in favor of investors. It's obvious, and since in that mechanism the state cannot sue the investor back, India is usually sided with Brazil in the opinion that it's a little unfair to the state, because essentially if you see how it works, an investor stakes a claim and the state as a sitting duck becomes a participant to the dispute. Interestingly, the India-Brazil BIT has no provision for ISDS, which is actually there in its model BIT. So in the India model BIT, we have ISDS and SSDS, which is investor state and state to state. The Brazil and India BIT focuses only on the state to state dispute. And in fact, an interesting aspect before I move forward is that both India and Brazil have attempted to they've introduced it in the preamble of the BIT itself, that this is a BIT which is more about facilitation and cooperation rather than investment protection, which I think is really interesting. So one thing to be taken away is that this BIT is, it only contemplates state-to-state dispute, which is a bit reminiscent of earlier diplomatic channels being used to resolve disputes. What this essentially means is that if there is a dispute, an investor will have to move it through the host state. Of course, there's a concern there as to what happens when the state does not embrace the investor's dispute. And this goes for both India and Brazil, right? For example, if India has an investment, if an Indian investor has an investment in Brazil pursuant to this BIT, then we are going to see a few, it remains to be seen how this will be raised, how India will embrace it, because the dispute technically first goes to the joint committee. There is a mediation conciliation aspect in the Brazil BIT. It doesn't straight away jump to arbitration, and which is good. I think one aspect is that India is now going to have an option of, coming to the table to discuss the dispute before it becomes a full-fledged arbitrable matter. With regard to which I'll just point out that the provisions for the dispute prevention in the BIT are very interesting. And they talk about a joint committee reference, which is a constituted committee of representatives from both Brazil and India. So we're not seeing any sort of adjudication happening at this level. There's a reference to the joint committee. If the joint committee can't come to a decision, it refers you to state arbitration. And even then, the arbitral tribunal has the power to kind of interpret the treaty, interpret whether there's been a breach, but does not award compensation, cannot award compensation. So an interesting question which arises out of this is how beneficial is it to the investors involved? I mean, of course, there is a non-monetary compensation, but I'm still I'm not able to comment on this conclusively, but I think the use of the word compensation instead of damages is extremely interesting, because compensation we've seen is usually with respect to expropriation claims, and damages are with respect to the breach of VITs. So, and another thing which ties to the compensation point is that the India-Brazil VIT room for direct expropriation, and categorically has taken away any claims which relate to indirect expropriation. Why this is interesting in the current framework and current global scenario is that there are very few instances of direct expropriation. You know, in this day and age, you will not see a government simply reaches hand into your bank account and take what you own, and then you can keep suing them for give me compensation for fair market value, etc. So what is tricky, it's going to be tricky for an investor to raise a dispute to its host state when even a regulatory measure by a host state will not really sure if there's what is intended and how this in my opinion it's a hole which has it's a gaping sort of a problem in the BIT. Another interesting factor is that because of the way that both the countries are and how their economies work, and they are you know, India and Brazil are also part of BRICS, they're also part of IFTA. So keeping that in mind, I think it's extremely interesting that they have put in a specific provision for combating corruption, which kind of lays to, you know, which lays down that if an investment is stemming from illicit means, or the tracing back of the investment, or any of the investment is based on the proceeds from corruption, then that claim itself becomes inarbitrable. So at least with regard to this BIT, we can say that at least these claims are definitely not arbitrable. And I think I'll just wrap up really quickly a couple more points. I think the most interesting part that you mentioned leading up to this discussion was, you know, how investors have legitimate expectations when they enter a state, or when they invest into a state, there is legitimate expectation that their investment will be protected, and laws and reforms will not take place detrimental to their investment. And interestingly, the model BIT notwithstanding, there is no FET provision in the Brazil-India BIT, which to me is, so what they've done is they've narrowed it down. They've mentioned denial of justice, they've mentioned due process, and everything else, a good faith, transparency, etc., is not mentioned. So I'm a little concerned, because if you see, this obviously could be stemming from the fact that both Brazil and India have been of the view that investment tribunals in the past tend to prioritize investors' interests vis-a-vis FET claims, and also tend to not be able to appreciate the state's prerogative in having done actions which are, you know, in the interest of public, etc. I'm not certain of how this will be perceived and how this will actually be resolved, in the sense that, you know, because you've got a double tier dispute resolution system in this BIT, where you've got an investor, he starts the diplomatic machinery, gets the host state, the matter goes to the joint committee. The joint committee simply tries to ensure that the investment and the facilitation and cooperation continues. So my first reading of the BIT that did raise some concerns about certain aspects not being clearly laid out for I'm not really sure how much of efficacy would this sort of an investor state, a state-to-state disputes mechanism will display. But I do think it's a very, very brave attempt at kind of, you know, trying to get the state sovereignty issue addressed, whereby both states at least are more likely to come to the table when you've got a tribunal that is not awarding compensation. So if in the past, you've seen states being a little hesitant in participating in a dispute which is stemming out of an investment dispute. I think one of the positives of the fact that the tribunal cannot award compensation, is not going to award compensation, means that maybe the host states are more likely to sit at the table and resolve it before it becomes a dispute, which I think might go to the objective of prevention of dispute under the India-Brazil BIT. So, Shwetha, I think in the current scenario with the model BIT, one interesting thing that lastly that I'll conclude with, the model BIT actually also prevented investors, prevented tax disputes from, the purview of investment arbitration. And the difference was that in the the decision of the host state was final and not justiciable. However, in the India-Brazil BIT, we see that the language is not reflecting this non-justiciable issue. So, which means that it's still open for, it would still be open to how a tax regulatory measure is handled under the India-Brazil BIT, because it doesn't have the non-justiciable protection, which is there under the India model BIT.
Thank you, Mansi. Those are all key points. I think we're running close to the session, but I just wanted to quickly take last 1 minute to pin the session back to the first session where Ishan asked the question on institutional arbitration. So of course, there has been a lot of talk, within India and outside about institutionalizing arbitration as a way to make the whole system more efficient and effective. But I think there has been very little being talked about institutionalizing investment arbitrations. Rishab did mention that, under the current regime, of course, India is not a signatory to ICSID. And there are very few institutional rules, that cater to investment arbitration. Of course, he did mention about the SIAC rules, which have been designed to balance the interest of both states and the investor. So my last question to you and Ravi both, what can India do, to be able to, when it's pushing this institutional arbitration, to be able to take that account for both commercial and investment arbitration? Ravi, do you want to go first?
Okay. I frankly don't know what India can do. It definitely is something that India should do. One of the reasons why I think it is even more important is, there is a sentiment in India where anything private is not really looked at with the same amount of respect. So at least giving it some institutional authority, color to it, lends it a little more weight, and therefore the chances of it being looked at with far more authority are higher. But in terms of how exactly, I frankly don't really have a very concrete answer to that question. Except that I think that this goes back to the initial points that Rishab was making, that it's a lot about the kind of culture that we want to create over a period of time. And that's something that's an ongoing effort rather than any silver bullet or few specific pointers that can be taken into consideration while doing it. That's what I have to say. I don't know. I really don't have a very specific answer to that question.
Mansi, any quick points from you?
No, Shwetha, I think Ravi and Rishab have covered it all. If I try to add more apart from what I've already said, I think then I'll completely diverge from the topic today. So I'm concluded. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice also a little bit.
So I think that's the last thought that we wanted to leave you with. To really how do you make arbitration in India more efficient and effective, and how can India really become the new center in that sense, in not just Asia but in the world for arbitration. So over to you.
I think I'll just add one more point. This last point that you have made, I think there is and this again is something which Rishab touched upon, and jokingly I tell this to a lot of people, that judges in this country need to be trained in economics. Or if not economics, then at least finance. It's something which tells them that everything that they decide has an impact, way beyond what they can possibly imagine, and nobody is stopping them from deciding within the four corners of the law to which they are bound, the constitution that they are bound. But a little bit of awareness about what one decision can do, and here I'm talking about, respecting arbitration awards, giving it the authority that it requires, and in fact, promoting it actively so that it becomes a more of a cultural norm in the country. That's something which needs to be done, but that can happen only through a change in mindset. In my view, I don't see any shortcut for it.
Thank you, Ravi. Ishan, over to you. Thank you once again for getting us together and brainstorming on this very, very important subject.
Thank you. Thank you to all. I think it was a fantastic session, very informative. Special thanks to Ravi, because he comes in from a special place, a different place, and shares a perspective that you won't really get at one place, concretized and under the same umbrella. So special thanks to Ravi. In the meanwhile, I have to make a couple of announcements, but in the meanwhile, I'll also simultaneously share the polls that you can continue to vote on, the audience. First off, this is something that I announced early at the start of this day of event, before the first session, and I'm going to make that announcement again. It's a disclaimer that views shared by the speakers today may not necessarily reflect the views of any organization, entity, or firm that they may be associated or affiliated with. The views are primarily academic for the purpose of discussion. Anything discussed here shall not be attributable to any related organizations unless the speakers or panelists desired or otherwise so indicated. It's important to tread this path so that nothing can go against anyone, because we are here to discuss, we are here to promote ADR, we are here to share our ideas, our concerns, and evolve on this journey of ADR as a global force for good. So thank you so much for bearing with that that disclaimer. I'm going to move to the next poll question. Why? Because it's very important that all of you, the audience, are helping us in collating this data, which is going to contribute to a larger publication at the end of this world tour. But besides that, I think it was a great learning experience this entire day. I would say the first session and the second session. Thank you to everyone who stayed during this 2.5 hours. I know it can get long, it's a Zoom fatigue, but then I can also say that it's a masterclass on ADR in India, and therefore I personally find a lot of value being created here. And a very big thank you to Shwetha. She said I gave an exaggerated introduction for her, but at least I can now say thank you so much for the great moderation you did. Thank you so much to my friends and colleagues, Ravi and Manasi, for their wonderful inputs and the perspectives you brought in. And special thanks to Dr. Rishab